This is Two Broads Talking Politics. Today's guest is Lila Nordstrom, author of the new book, Some Kids Left Behind, A Survivor's Fight for Healthcare in the Wake of 9/11. So hi, everyone. This is Two Broads Talking Politics. I am Kelly, and the other broad with me today is Lila Nordstrom, who has a new book out called Some Kids Left Behind, A Survivor's Fight for Healthcare in the Wake of 9/11. So hi, Lila.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining me. So let me just say this is an incredible book. It's such a moving, warm, sometimes funny, unexpectedly funny memoir, but also discussion of politics and how politics works. So I'm really grateful that you wrote it. But I wanted to start not by asking why this topic, because that will become obvious to people, but why write a book and why write it now?
I think, I've been thinking a lot about how I want to move forward with the story of being a 9/11 victim on the 20th anniversary, because I think commemorations of 9/11 are often very rear-facing. It's very much about the experiences of this one day itself and how world-changing that day was. And for those of us that have lived with health consequences from that day, this is really a much more present story in our lives than it is just a commemoration of a time 20 years ago that a thing happened. And I think that, I live in California, though I'm from New York. I know because of that there's not a really clear understanding outside of New York City of how wide-ranging the effects of the environmental disaster of 9/11 were. And it was really important to me that I validate that story so that future survivors know to see themselves in this story. And also that I provide a roadmap of what I've learned, because there are so many disaster communities that exist in the United States. I would argue that in the era of COVID, we're kind of all part of a big disaster community. And it was important to me that we start thinking about how to take the memory of 9/11 and look forward from it, instead of just thinking about it as this unique, special thing that happened to only some of us, 20 years ago. I think there's a lot to learn from the way that we responded to 9/11. There's a lot to learn from the experiences we had advocating for ourselves. And I wanted to kind of lay that out.
Yeah. So let's sort of set the stage then for people who haven't yet read the book, but they should. You were a senior in high school during 9/11 and were 3 blocks from the Twin Towers and saw it through the windows, saw it happening. As you're thinking about writing, I mean, I'm sure this is true anytime you write a memoir, but writing a memoir about, in part about an event that happened 20 years ago when you were a high schooler that has gotten so much coverage. So your own memories are probably overlaid with things that you've seen and heard and read since then. What is the process for that? Like, how do you go back and try to reconstruct what happened to you, what you experienced, both from your own memories, but, are there other things that you're consulting as you're thinking through that?
Absolutely. And I think for me in particular, it was really important that a lot of what I write in the book also be verifiable, that this also act as a kind of memory of the events as they occurred to people like me. It was important to me that there be a record of the event from the perspective of someone like me, because I just really haven't seen much of that in media. And so although there is a huge amount of coverage of what happened after 9/11, not a lot of it focuses on how an event like that touches individuals in an ongoing fashion and can kind of reroute your life. But I also felt like the community story after 9/11 had really not gotten a fair telling. And so it was important to me that in the course of telling my story, I also create kind of a historical record of what happened to the community after 9/11 and where missteps were made and where the community was mistreated or overlooked. And so I approached this a little differently than I think I would have approached a more traditional memoir project. First of all, remembering a detailed account of what happened to you over the last 20 years is very difficult. And I actually my first draft of the book, I just tried to write everything down that I remembered. And some of it turned out I remembered because I'd seen it on the news. And some of it turned out I remembered because it was my actual memories. And some of it turned out, contradicted accounts of other people that were with me on the day. And that was something I expected because traumatic memories are notoriously unreliable. And so this is a pretty common occurrence with people who are recounting a traumatic incident. But I felt like, if I could get my account out first and then go back and find ways to verify that everything happened, which I was able to do, thankfully, there were two sources that were tremendously useful to me. One was that though the New York Times has really not done much coverage of the survivor community since 9/11, they actually did a really detailed account of what the community was going through right after 9/11. And so a lot of that was in the newspaper. And so that was useful because I was able to verify a lot of things that I remembered through that. But then also my mother kept basically every document she'd ever been handed that year, from the Parents Association, from the city, there were all these letters flying back and forth that year that were about the air quality, and she kept everything. And so I had this store of information that was just thanks to my mother's sort of pre-planning that I was able to consult, and that also was able to verify a lot of what I remembered. It's also been helpful to me that because I've been an advocate on this issue for so long, I have had some continuity with telling the story, whereas a lot of people, have had big gaps in their lives where they really haven't spoken about this. I've never had a gap where I didn't speak about this in my life. So the story that I was telling in 2006, when I first became an advocate, has been remarkably consistent because I started telling it, only a few years after it happened. And I, because of that, have kind of been able to remember it all the way through. So I think that's why I was the person that thought I should write this book. And, I know a lot of people have written memoirs of how 9/11 affected them, have written memoirs of their lives since 9/11. A lot of the memoirs in this category are about overcoming personal obstacles like addiction recovery and, the loss of family members or things like that. And I wanted this to be more of an inclusive story about, what it is to be part of this community.
So there's sort of two things that affect your life. There's the actual event. There's 9/11 that happens, and you and presumably most of the people who were in the school that day and in the area that day have some form of PTSD from that. But that isn't where most of the other health problems happen. It's not that day that is the problem for you, right? It is when you come back into your high school less than a month later, having been told, this is safe, it's fine, you can go there. That is actually what causes the health problems for your community. So can you talk about some of what sort of the environmental, I think for those of us who weren't there, who haven't lived that, like what the environment was, why was it so dangerous? What was it about it that sort of caused health problems? And what are the kinds of health problems, presumably a huge range of them that came out of that?
The collapse of the Twin Towers was kind of a unique building collapse because the buildings kind of fell in on themselves. And so they based all the building materials got pulverized. And so I think, people remember those images of like steel girders, smoking atop a pile. But what a lot of the debris was just dust. And dust gets everywhere. And so not only was it a fire that burned until January, so, I think a lot of people who weren't at the site don't realize how long that site was on fire, but there was a consistent fire that burned at Ground Zero until the end of January of 2002. People, residents, office workers had been back in the neighborhood for 4 or 5 months by that point. And then, on top of that, the cleanup effort required them to move huge amounts of pulverized building material around the neighborhood to barges. Manhattan is a small island. There are not landfills on Manhattan. So all of the debris had to be taken to another island, which meant that all of it had to be put on barges and transported to Staten Island. And that meant that they had to park the barges somewhere. And the barges were parked right next to our school. So what began as, a disaster already because, obviously, there were these huge dust clouds that coated people in dust and also coated one side of my school in dust. But there was actually no reason for people in my situation to be exposed to the pulverized building materials because most of us did not end up caught in that dust cloud. I was able to evacuate that day without being caught in the dust cloud. What happened was the dust cloud just got continually whipped up by the cleanup efforts. They were transporting just dump trucks filled with these pulverized building materials back and forth all, around our school. They were dumping them right next to our school. And that was creating sort of new dust exposure for people. And that was, our building was already not adequately cleaned when we arrived, but the building got recontaminated fairly quickly because of the way that they were cleaning up the site. And so I think, a lot of people don't realize, like I said, that the fires were burning, but they also don't realize that the cleanup effort as it was going on was continually recontaminating the whole neighborhood. It wasn't just staying contained at the site. So that's why so many of us got sick. And also, it wasn't just school children. Obviously, people who lived in the neighborhood cleaned up their residences without proper safety precautions, because at the time, largely for political and economic reasons, we were being told, no, don't worry, it's safe. Yes, you have nosebleeds, but those will be temporary. Don't worry about that. There will be no long-term consequences to the headaches and nosebleeds you guys are experiencing. So just don't worry too much about that. Obviously, there is almost no time that continual smoke inhalation does not cause long-term health complications. And this was an additionally problematic kind of smoke because it was mixed with this dust, that included a lot of toxins that are, parts of buildings. So, early on, they were very obsessed with finding out if there was lead. And there was lead, it turned out. But lead was really the least of our problems. There was like a whole cocktail of dangerous chemicals in this dust. So, the health issues began fairly predictably with respiratory health issues, headaches, things like that. I began experiencing respiratory health concerns right away. And then, over time, we found that our community lags a few years behind first responders in terms of what kinds of serious illnesses we face, because we were much younger when we were exposed. But, you started to see first responder cancers pretty quickly. And then a few years later, you started to see those same cancers in our school population. And that's kind of been the trend that's continued. So, what began as more common cancers in young adults and cancers with shorter latency periods like thyroid cancers and blood cancers and things like that has since transformed into breast cancers, prostate cancers. And this is, I would remind you, in a population that is entirely under the age of 40. Most of them are under 35. So we're not talking about people who are in high risk categories for things like breast cancer normally. And the other issues that we have are that there's not a lot of good data on the survivor community. So we know anecdotally that we're seeing high numbers of cancers in the same areas that first responders are seeing high numbers of cancers. But the first responder community doesn't have a lot of women in it. And so a lot of women's health concerns are not well documented. We anecdotally hear a lot about autoimmune disorders, but those are not covered by the World Trade Center Health Program. They're not connected, or they're not officially linked to the attacks. Autoimmune concerns are linked to the kinds of exposure that we had, but because there's been no data on this population, we don't have coverage for some of those concerns. So there's also a lot of, in terms of women's reproductive health cancers, there's a very uneven coverage where you're covered for cervical cancer, but not uterine cancer. And I don't know how could those possibly have remarkably different causes when it comes to environmental exposure? But there's kind of we're sort of behind the 8 ball a lot of the time in terms of discovering what conditions we're going to end up seeing. But luckily, we also have the model of the first responders to sort of see what we're going to see trickling down into our community. But at the moment, the cancer rates are growing. The autoimmune disorders are getting reported at much higher rates. Those primarily affect women. So those are also, something that you don't see a lot reflected in the data, but are pretty significant in the community. And then the other area where we're not really sure what to expect and we're not really sure what is and is not linked is in developmental health related concerns. So ways that this kind of exposure shaped people's endocrine systems and things like that. There's not good data on that because there was no tracking of the people that were exposed as children. And so we expect that this has had consequences for our health. A lot of us have bizarre health concerns that we can't really articulate as a kind of general, condition. But those are things that we also expect are likely linked to those exposures.
So I think people who have heard about the legislation and the fight for legislation for World Trade Center related diseases have probably not heard that much about the survivor community, that it's mostly been what did the first responders experience and how do we cover them? So can you talk some about your advocacy journey and sort of just trying to this is not a small community of survivors. This is a lot of people who are affected, but how hard it's been to sort of get attention on that particular community.
Yeah, there's something about the way we like conceive of healthcare policy and who deserves healthcare protections that is very much based in a sense that like you should make a sacrifice and deserve it, as opposed to a sense that just everyone kind of like inherently deserves some sort of health protection. And so, we've come up a lot of the time after something like 9/11, and I think we've seen this a lot with the COVID crisis, we kind of lean on war metaphors. We lean on the sort of symbolism of who sacrificed and who rushed in and who were the heroes. And, we see that a lot where we're constantly glorifying doctors who, of course, are doing heroic work after COVID. But like also, if your uncle was lied to and didn't realize that wearing a mask protected him, then like that is a kind of policy failure as well. And your uncle doesn't not deserve protection just because he wasn't, quote unquote, a hero. He's a person who lives in society whose government was charged with protecting him and did not. And I think in the same way, we faced a lot of challenges as the survivor community, because there was a perception that as people who weren't heroes, we were speaking out of turn in asking for access to some of the benefits that responders had. I think, and there's the issue of self-identification in a community like that as well, because responders are by and large very proud to have been part of this rescue effort. And, I've spent a lot of time on the Hill with first responders. I know that community really well. I have a lot of great friends, that I've made in that community, and all of them are incredibly proud of the work that they did at Ground Zero. And the survivor community does not get to feel the same way because we were just straight victims of a bad policy. And I want to note it was victims of a bad policy, not necessarily just victims of a terrorist attack. I think there's also a sense that, this was sort of an act of God, almost like an act that we couldn't control that just sort of fell on our doorstep. The decision to send us all back into that area, though, was made by the U.S. government. It was not made by foreign terrorists. And so a lot of the fault for what ended up happening to our community really belongs on our own doorstep, not on some sort of like doorstep we can't control out yonder. And so I think, our involvement in this advocacy work has always been there, but it has often been overlooked in part because we couldn't access a hero narrative. And I would say that's also a very gendered narrative. That's a narrative that requires, it often leans on metaphors about rushing into things and being strong and risking survivors out of rubble and things like that. And that's just like not, there were only 6 women in the fire department on 9/11. That's not a narrative that necessarily reflects women. And I've actually spoken to a lot of female first responders who are constantly coming up against the problem of people not believing that they're first responders because they're women. And so that's already a challenge that the community faces, because community advocates, by and large, and I would say in a lot of crises, not just after 9/11, end up being women. They start as moms. And then, other women from the community step up. But when you think about who steps up for communities after a crisis, it is almost always women first. And then if you're lucky, some men step up because then you get taken seriously. But it's really hard to get heard as a community of female advocates. And so on the Hill, we had to kind of rely on some interesting dynamics. I mean, one of the more disappointing dynamics that was helpful to my work, but also just like horribly depressing to think about, was the fact that at a certain point, I started relying on first responders to repeat everything that I said in our lobbying meetings so that they would actually be heard, because I think even they noticed that no one was listening to me and I was being mistaken for a staffer everywhere. And I had to kind of think, I had to rely on some theater to get over that. I had to start dressing down on the Hill to stop being treated like a staffer, which is such a funny dynamic to find yourself in. But I'm a woman. I was much younger than the other advocates. I'm the youngest advocate who's been really active on this issue. And I look like a first year staffer on the Hill and always have and continue to, even though I'm now in my late 30s. And so, there were some dynamics like that I had to rely on just to make sure our story didn't get lost. But there were also a lot of times where, for political reasons, we were asked to step back, and for reasons that maybe weren't going to benefit us, because there was also, I think, an understanding on the Hill and elsewhere that it's really hard to sell a story about communities. People don't care about civilians in the same way that they care about heroes. And I always think that's so funny, because most people are civilians. And so it feels like, if you can see yourself reflected in any part of the 9/11 recovery effort, it should be my story that you see, unless you are a fireman, it is most likely my story that you see yourself reflected in. That's one of the reasons I thought it was important that someone like me write a book and someone like me explain the connections between, what a government can do for people after a crisis and what, we expect them to do, which is often much less. So yeah, the community dynamics on the Hill and elsewhere were often a little frustrating. I would note for your listeners that the survivor community is 3 or 4 times the size of the responder community. It's a much larger community. It's a vastly more female community, and it's a community that includes lots of young people. There were 19,000 public school students that were in school in the exposure zone. There were likely 25 or 30,000 other either students or kids who were not of school age who were attending community colleges and other places in the area. And so this is a huge population of people. The survivor community as a whole is estimated to be 300,000 or 400,000 people. And so this is a large community of people to represent. We were often being represented by fewer representatives than the responder community. I testified before Congress in 2019. There was a panel where there were 4 people to speak for the responder community, and I was the only person to speak for the survivor community on the panel. That blows my mind because that was the exact opposite proportion of how many people there were in these communities. But that I think is also one of the reasons that I really advocate for people to put pressure on their state governments to collect as much disaggregated data about COVID deaths and COVID illnesses in their state as possible, because the way that we got excluded from a lot of these conversations was that no one thought to get data on us in the first place. And so when we showed up to the conversation, the firemen had data and we did not. And that really made it hard to advocate for ourselves.
Yeah, and you talk so poignantly in the book about how a lot of this population of 300,000 to 400,000 people is people of color, is immigrants, but it took a white high school student to be the one to sort of get attention. And can you sort of expand on that a little bit, like what that tells us about the people who are falling through the cracks after disasters, about, and it's all sorts of disasters, right? You talk about Flint, there's Katrina, there's all sorts of things that happen that it's difficult to get attention on and to get people to provide the resources and support that we need to.
Yeah, there are certain kinds of agency that you have access to as a white middle class person, even and in a community that's being overlooked, that you don't have access to if you are someone who doesn't speak English well, if you are someone who cannot introduce yourself as a Vassar graduate, if you are someone who can't pull together the funds to to go to Washington, and if you're someone who just can't speak with inherent authority about, community issues. I mean, the exposure zone that we're talking about, it includes all of Chinatown. It includes a lot of the Lower East Side, and the communities that were able to get the ear of the politicians who, were eventually, who became our advocates, were communities that had access to them in the first place. Those are communities like Tribeca and Battery Park City that are primarily white and middle class. And that's, as somebody who, I'm not from those communities, but I'm sort of from that larger community, I had certain kinds of advantages just because I also came from a community where I had been trained to speak to politicians in the first place. My mom used to take me to Washington when I was a kid, and we would go visit our representatives. And that was its own kind of education. I'm one of the few people who got to have a civics class in high school. And that's only because I was going to this very well-funded public school that had that as an elective. I'm somebody who, whose only days off from school that I was allowed to take were to go to protests. And so I was aware of kind of how an activist can interact with the government and what the dynamic is that allows an activist to be effective. And these are all, advantages that largely came because of my background. And these are also advantages that, while theoretically, I guess, could be open to anyone, are tremendously easier when you know that you're going to have the funds to go find the politicians where they are, when you know that media is going to take you more seriously than they're going to take somebody whose English isn't very good, or who cannot speak, who doesn't speak the sort of dialect of, like university English that all, that we all speak in. And like, I think that is why there are two reasons that I think that we didn't get fully overlooked. One is that there were middle class and wealthy white people that were affected by this disaster. And that is, of course, when you look at who actually gets attention after a crisis, you often don't, you hear sort of like tragic human interest stories about other communities, but you hear action in white middle class communities. And I think the other advantage that we had was that we had the coattails of men to ride. We had the coattails of first responders to ride. When I think about what's happened in Flint, where how long have we been talking about the Flint water crisis? It feels like my entire adult life. And, why didn't we see immediate action on that? Well, that was a community who had no coattails to ride, in addition to being a community that was largely disenfranchised for other reasons, for reasons of race, for reasons of economic advantages, for things like that. And so I think a lot of the time, the kind of the communities that end up getting effective results and the communities that end up actually getting their voices heard end up being communities that have some sort of cultural and economic capital. And that, I think, is why it's why I was able to stay involved in this issue for so long. This has not been my job. This is not what I do for work. And oftentimes, I'm a freelancer. I oftentimes have been living at a loss. But, as I say in the book, I knew someone would bail me out if I ran out of money. I knew someone would make sure I got to Washington if I needed to get to Washington. And just that inherent advantage makes your advocacy work so much more effective. I did a lot of this work without any sort of budget. I didn't fundraise to do this work. I did all of it sort of on a volunteer basis for many years. And I was able to do that because I had other resources.
Yeah. I always like to focus on sort of action steps. And you have this great, at the end of your book, you talk about sort of, how to do this kind of advocacy work. You set it up as like, I didn't know what I was doing. I made it up. So learn from me. So what are some of the things that people can learn from your experiences about how to go about doing this kind of work?
Well, I always describe my parents and I as chaos people because we don't work well in groups. And that's just like a family issue that we have. But my mother is an activist sort of in her bones. And so a lot of this was modeled on what I saw her do and get away with. My mother's also 4'7". So she's teeny tiny. She's adorable. And because she's so adorable, she can get away with a lot of things that other people can't get away with. She can totally lose it at a meeting of the Chelsea anti-war, whoever, or whatever she's involved in. And she can go in the next day and everyone's nice to her. So I think part of what I learned is that everyone has to sort of figure out what their secret thing is that makes them effective, what their unexpected advantage is, because part of the reason my mother does this, has learned this is because no one listens to her otherwise. If she doesn't completely lose it in a meeting, she is talked over and ignored for the entire meeting. So she has to do that to be heard because that's what it's like to be that small and a woman. But it kind of, it also means that she has figured out how to use her ability to do that to her advantage and has, because of that, always been able to be active in a lot of activist communities. I kind of tried to use that model. I think, there's this sort of lore that you always hear about how Occupy Wall Street was not effective because there weren't clear policy outcomes to that work. And you hear it a lot, even in progressive circles. And I think that my main advice is that I push back on that notion because the thing that Occupy taught me is you just go and do the thing that you're able to do in an activist role. And so if you are good at writing, if you're a good storyteller, then congratulations, you have one of the most important advocacy skills that you could possibly have. I think there's this sense that you have to be good at directing an organization to be a good advocate. And that's absolutely not true. It's a completely different skill set. I am terrible at the sort of executive director side of being an advocate. I am a good storyteller. I'm a writer. That's what I do for a living. And that is what I found allowed me to be effective in these roles. And I think also there's this sense that first of all, you get a lot of patronizing advice when you're a young woman trying to be an advocate. And a lot of that advice I just ultimately had to ignore because a lot of it was designed to prevent me from actually, sort of taking on the roles that I knew I would be effective at. And then the other advice that you always get is that you have to fundraise first. And I didn't fundraise at all for this project. I did it because it seemed like an important thing to do. I just, I spoke out and then I asked my friends to speak out with me when that was necessary. I relied on media. I relied on social media. I relied on things that would be free to do in order to get the word out about this. And as much as like money helps and resources help, of course they do. I think a lot of the time people are dissuaded from even starting something because they think that the first step has to be to start fundraising, and they don't have family members or friends with deep pockets, which, a lot of people don't. And especially people who are in situations where they need some political action often don't. So I think that my sort of big takeaway that I want people to have from my lame attempt at giving them activism advice is just that you probably shouldn't take anyone's advice too seriously. And you should also lean on the thing that you'll be good at and the thing that you can get away with, and not worry so much that you can't follow in the exact path of other advocates that you admire.
So we're coming up on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, which I'm sure is going to be difficult for you and the people in your community. How would you like people to mark the occasion, or not mark the occasion, perhaps?
I think, I would like us to mark the occasion as an opportunity to think about what we can do for each other to protect each other. I don't think that it's helpful to spend more than 20 years just thinking about this one world-altering event, because we are currently in the middle of a world-altering event. And so obviously world-altering events don't permanently alter the world, because other things come along and alter it again. I think a lot of the time, though, the thing that frustrates me about the way that we commemorate 9/11 is we're so obsessed with #NeverForgetting, and we're so solemn, and we don't use the opportunity to think, what could we have learned from the way we responded to this event, and what can we move forward knowing we want to do next time? And because we haven't done that, I've seen a lot of the same mistakes get made again and again after crises. I see the exact same arguments that were used to justify sending me back to school in an unsafe zone getting used to justify sending kids back to school without COVID precautions being taken, in the same words even. And so I think, like, for me, the most important thing is that if we're going to mark this day, I know there was an attempt to turn it into kind of like a day of service. And I would almost rather we turn it into a day of reflection where we think about what we want to take forward from that experience, as opposed to just what changed on that day. Because I think if I've learned anything in the COVID period, it's that every generation has a moment that changes everything for that generation, and life is never the same. And I never related to why my parents were so obsessed with the JFK assassination until I went through 9/11 and thought, oh, okay, that was like a life-altering event that changed everything about the way people conceived of where they lived and who they were. And that is what happened on 9/11. And that's going to happen to this COVID generation and to all of us in the aftermath of COVID. And so I don't think necessarily harping on one particular incident is the answer. I want to talk about the connections that the survivor community and that the 9/11 community in general has to other disaster communities, not that we're special and unique, you know?
Mm-hmm. So how can people get your book?
You can get my book at all the major internet booksellers. You can do it at Bookshop. You can do it at Amazon. You can do it at, I think, IndieBound and Books A Million and those kind of places. You can find links to all of those on my website, which is lilanordstrom.com. And then if you are in a major metropolitan area, you may also be able to find it in your local bookstore. You can always order it through your local bookstore if it's not available. That helps me a lot, because that helps a lot of bookstores in places that are not already familiar with my work find out about it. And so yeah, it's available wherever books are sold, as they say.
Excellent. And I will link to your website in the show notes so that people can find it there too. Well, Lila, thank you so much. I hope that people will read it. Like I said, it's an incredible read. It's a really great memoir, and gave me insight into, sort of an understanding of 9/11 that I didn't previously have. And then, of course, anyone who's interested in politics, and you wouldn't be listening to this podcast if you weren't, we'll get a lot of insights about how congressional action happens or doesn't happen, and hearings.
And I wanted it to be like a real inside baseball account, so people wouldn't be shocked when they try to go do this work and there are some ups and downs.
Yeah. Well, excellent. Thank you, Lila.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Dimcast Podcast Network. Our theme song is called Are You Listening off of the album Elephant Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at twobroadstalk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.